Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading White Women Get Ready, How Healing Post-Traumatic Mistress Syndrome Leads to Anti-Racist Change. This is a book I am working on for my own practice every morning, and if you would like a copy and to follow along for the next couple months, you can get copies attached here. The Birth of Patriarchy. One could say I was pissed about patriarchy from the moment my mother pushed me out of her womb. Upset about gender rules and the whole female submission thing, I spent much of my childhood proving I could compete by being better, stronger, smarter, and more dominant than the boys around me. Unfortunately for my kid brother, he was the one boy typically at hand. My heart hurts to recall how he received intensive, round-the-clock training in emotional harm from my misdirected rage. I co-parented my brother into the ways of toxic masculinity. When he cried, I pushed him to push down his emotions. I modeled domination, brute force, and psychological manipulation. I realize now that in order to do this, I had to push down my own tenderness, too. Bell Hooks could just have well been talking about our sibling dynamic when she said, patriarchy has no gender. In fact, reinforcing toxic masculinity has proven a key contribution of white womanhood. This helps explain why some of the most vocal proponents of white Christian patriarchy are women. Amy Coney Barrett, anyone? Some of the most well-positioned proponents of U.S. imperialism and violent warfare have been, too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We are still learning how to tie our shoes, beginning with the patriarchy. It turns out that the racial and economic disparities we have today are a direct result of European patriarchy's reorganizing of human relationships away from cooperation and collaboration into control and domination. And this is one of the reasons that I say that coercive control and cults are patriarchal, because they are about control and domination. Which brings up a heap of questions that somehow never made my school's history curriculum, like where did patriarchy come from? Why did we reject cooperation and collaboration? And in Europe, from which patriarchy spread via colonization, was there ever a time when patriarchy wasn't the main or deal? I want this so badly to be the case. It is hard for me not to paint an idealistic pre-patriarchy picture. In my linear thinking, I wish for there to be something to return to, something before, some time, some culture, some historic utopia where my ancestry cultivated enoughness and collaboration rather than contributing to hierarchies and violence. I want documentation so that I can prove that those of us who descended from Europeans have cultures that precede and transcend our oppressive legacies. I look to historical records for proof of my humanity. And while no such perfect written documentation exists, there are both living and archaeological records that attest to a time in Europe when patriarchy did not dominate as an inevitable way of organizing social economic relationship. I'm flooded with relief. There was a time in Europe, as it has been and still is in many parts of the world, where patriarchy was not the only option. Across the majority of the globe, and even in Europe, throughout the Paleolithic era, before 10,000 BCE, and in the Neolithic area, between 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, there were societies that prioritized values of interconnectedness, revolved around cooperative economics, and celebrated the role of mothers and elders, grandmothers in particular, whose wisdom was central to the politics of the community. Although globally the pervasiveness of non-patriarchal societies began to dwindle, especially with the rise of monotheism, all over the world, from the banks of West Africa to the Haudenosaunee nation of what is now the northeastern U.S., cooperative societies were prevalent, that is, until the invasion of Europeans. Many of these cultures still vibrantly exist in spite of European invasions, and are as diverse in culture as they are in their forms of resistance. Of course, there are problems with describing non-patriarchal societies within the limits of patriarchal thinking. Non-patriarchal, matriarchal, and matricentric still describe ways of being on patriarchy's terms, as in not patriarchy, rule and centrism. There is also the risk that in collectivizing pre- or non-patriarchal societies, I will flatten out the nuances of many indigenous peoples and cultures, erasing diversities and histories. Again, this resource is a complement, not a substitute. As we consider what was going on in Europe 12,000 or 8,000 or 4,000 years ago, there's also the risk of accepting the assumptions of a patriarchal frame, of assuming that progress happens as we move forward in time with the evolution of our species and technologies. I'm reminded of George Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant, in which he shows how facts bounce off frames. It's not that facts are irrelevant, it's just that as humans, we pick and choose the ones that support our understanding of the world. A progress trajectory was the lens through which white male scholars viewed the history of European civilization, until Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas asked, circa 1950, and I paraphrase, what if patriarchy hadn't always been the rule in Europe? What if pre-patriarchal European societies were actually happier and healthier and less obsessed with violence? During her research and archaeological excavations in the following decades, that's more or less what she found. Gimbutas' Kurgan theory posits that the shift from indigenous to European cultures to patriarchy was a violent transition and attributed in part to increased land scarcity and climate change. According to scholar Christina Biaggi, circa 6600 BCE, climate change caused glaciers to melt, which rapidly flooded the Black Sea region, prompting whole communities to seek dry land. In the millennia that followed, lands became overgrazed, drying up and pushing nomadic tribes to invade neighboring societies. Other factors such as advances in weaponry and the domestication of the horse helped these nomadic groups travel greater distances. Loosely known as the Kurgans, these invading tribes spread across Europe, infiltrating non-patriarchal agricultural societies, killing, raping, enslaving, stealing, and replacing earth goddess worship with masculine sky gods. My goal here is not to lay out all the arguments for the Kurgan theory or to dig into studies on Eurasian linguistics or DNA, nor is it to go into depth about the theory's skeptics. Instead, it is to emphasize the power of Gimbutas' questions. Their possibilities resonated so much for me. What if European patriarchy hadn't always been the case? What if we white women actually had lineages in cooperative societies that treated the feminine as sacred and were less obsessed with violence? I think this is why Gimbutas' work has been so important for feminists searching for something before and beyond the violence of European patriarchy. We are looking for alternatives to the violence that came from our homelands. We too want to belong to societies, cultures, and spiritual traditions where we are seen as sacred. Perhaps Gimbutas' pre-Kurgan Europe offers us comfort within the dualism. I'm tempted to over-identify with those pre-patriarchal societies, to claim the people who inhabited the mountains and forests of current-day Switzerland, France, and Germany as my true ancestors, to sympathize with their historical plight, and to reject the injustices that caused such a tragic loss of their cultures. My orientation toward victimhood, perhaps you're noticing a theme, she talked before about how Mennonites are oriented toward victimhood, confuses the uncomfortable complexities of my history and DNA. Why am I so ready to identify with the suffering of colonized foremothers and so quick to dismiss the pastoral invaders as part of my ancestry, legacy, and DNA? Why do I want to opt out of my connection to the oppressor? Their blood runs in me too. This is the work of healing mistress syndrome, to see both oppressor and oppressed as parts of me, to accept the histories I am eager to claim and those I loathe, to realize more fully how my inheritance into imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy has both advantaged and harmed me, to recognize that these systems have deliberately created a false dichotomy that has fooled me into thinking I have to choose between my mother and my father. As one of my early readers pointed out, this false dichotomy brings up questions of opting out. Am I denying my whiteness in order to identify with the victimhood of being a woman? Who gets to claim which parts of an identity? Which parts do we try to hide from? Like what the white nationalists who seek to cover up their Jewish ancestry, like the one drop rule for people of African descent, our relationship to ancestral identity has also been framed by the power